Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much to all of you for joining us for today's Supporting Innovation in Education webinar. My name is Allison Goff-Clark. I'm a Senior Policy Analyst here at the Hunt Institute, and we're so grateful that you have all decided to spend an hour of your afternoon here with us. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started with today's conversation. We are looking forward to a great conversation with our panelists and experts today. You all as attendees will have an opportunity to ask questions at the end. We'll ask that you do that using the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your screen, and then we'll share those questions with our moderator. So you won't be able to come off mute, but we do invite you to share those questions throughout today's conversation using that Q&A feature. We are recording today's conversation and we'll be posting it with a little follow-up blog in the weeks to come. So please do keep an eye out for that and feel free to share that with your networks. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the Hunt Institute was created by four-term North Carolina Governor Jim Hunt to serve as an education policy resource for state leaders. Back in January, we had an initial conversation about the unique needs of students with disabilities and ways in which philanthropic organizations have partnered with districts and with educators to support students with disabilities during the pandemic. Today's conversation is a continuation of that first conversation. We're going to take a deeper dive into some of the innovations that schools, districts, and educators have put into place to ensure that we're serving all of our students, especially the 14% of public school students who receive specialized instruction and accommodations. We know that COVID-19 has had a disruptive impact on these students, in some cases preventing access to the specialized instruction and supports that were deemed necessary to provide a free and appropriate public education for our students. Today, we're going to hear from great expert panelists who are researchers, practitioners, and philanthropists who work every day to support students with disabilities. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jackie Mader of the Hechinger Report, who's going to lead today's conversation. Jackie?
Great, thank you so much, Allison. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining today. I'm Jackie Mader. I'm the multimedia editor and early childhood education reporter at the Hechinger Report. Before covering early ed, I covered K-12 for several years. And as a former special education teacher myself, I've tried to cover special education as much as possible. My colleagues and I have covered a range of issues within special education over the past few years, including the intersection of special education and preschool, shortened school days for students with disabilities, which means they are sent home early from school for months or even years, an investigation looking at how low expectations for students with disabilities track students into programs and classes that don't prepare them to meet their highest potential, and many others like this. Many of the stories that we've reported were before the pandemic, but we know, as Allison just mentioned, that the pandemic has impacted students with disabilities. It's resulted in lost learning time and services. So with that, I'm really looking forward to this conversation today where we can delve into what to do moving forward. I'm going to have the panelists introduce themselves, and I'd love to hear each of your thoughts on my first question, which is how should philanthropists, researchers, policymakers, and practitioners collaborate to ensure students with disabilities do have access to quality education during the COVID-19 recovery? Giselle, let's start with you.
Well, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you're logging in from. My name is Dr. Giselle C. Shorter, and I lead the National K-12 portfolio of giving at the Rakes Foundation and support policy efforts. The Rakes Foundation is committed to supporting youth serving systems to become just and equitable. The heartbeat of my school and system redesign portfolio is the BELL, Building Equitable Learning Environments Network. Collectively, BELL's membership leverages our resources to develop an educational system that ensures the intellectual, social, emotional, and cultural growth and well-being of all young people, and results in social cultural markers holding zero negative predictive power over the outcomes of students. So, really my life's work, the work that I lead at the foundation as well, is rooted in a deep belief that a just society starts with an equitable education. And so I come to this work with a passion to advance our democracy. One of the distinctions of the RAKE's approach to grant making and our EDGE strategy specifically is how we define the problem and where we center the imperative of educational equity and justice. You know, seeing the problem as one of system design has led us to focus on more structural issues, you know, how to design schools and higher ed institutions to equitably provide access, opportunities, but the environment, the conducive environment for all young people to have their needs met, including diverse learners. You know, so prior to 2020, a central goal of my work beyond my grant makers, grantees as the doers in the field, but the work that I retain most closely was supporting funders and field building activities to see the system, right? 2020 and the multidimensional crises, economic, climate, health, and then the social racial reckoning as a result of police violence. When compounding all of that and the educational disruption and crisis, you know, we really do see more people understanding, seeing the interconnections of our systems, and prioritizing work at the intersection of the science of learning and human development, equity, and community leadership. So in this moment, we recognize that schools and district leaders feel an urgent need to respond to the massive disruption to young people's lives and learning caused by the COVID crisis that is ongoing, and we're hearing will likely last well into the next academic year at the very least. So we see that, you know, and we know that the biggest educational harm is falling on students who have already overcome numerous barriers to engage and be successful, or those that were on the tipping point, those for whom school and its current structures, current ways of operating didn't really work for them to begin with. So the supremacy of relationships and a system's ability to reliably see, understand, and deploy resources to those that need them most is what I would say all education stakeholders should be focused on. Now, there are absolutely targeted approaches, target universalist approaches to meet the needs of young people that have been least well served. But when we stand on the balcony and I look across the 13,000 districts, what I would really encourage all of us to double down on is the infrastructure to see, understand, and deploy resources reliably so, and in ways that are constructive and empowering, such that they resonate for students and their families.
Thank you so much, Giselle. That was really, really helpful to hear. And you hit on so many good points there. Eddie, I would love to hear your thoughts, adding on to that. First, if you could introduce yourself and then share a little bit about your thoughts on the collaboration aspect that needs to happen.
Sure, definitely. Good morning and afternoon to whomever, wherever you're chiming in from, which is one of the beautiful things of this virtual world, that now anybody can kind of chime in when they can, right? So excited to kind of have this opportunity to sit with Sarah and Giselle and engage in these conversations with the Hunt Institute, and Jackie, you moderating sort of this conversation is great. I think in terms of my background, I am a professor at Temple University in urban education and policy, and my work swims around the attention to disparities that exist within school systems. For the last 18 years, I've been like a dog with a bone around disproportionality in special education, suspension, and gifted AP and honors, what I call the trifecta of school practices that all interact in such a way that are parallel with each other, right? So it's the manner in which they are not only sort of continuously impacting very particularized populations, in specifically racial ethnic minority student populations, interacting with students with disabilities in particular ways, students who are eligible for free and reduced lunch, and as well as language minority students, right? And my curiosity has been not only sort of the nature to which how these outcomes are manifesting within these particular environments, but also the question on the other side, right, of, which is, and what do we do about it, right? And as an applied researcher, as I see myself, where it's not only I like studying stuff, but I also like to study fixing stuff, right? What does it necessarily take? What's the right sort of set of levers that need to be in action here? And to your question, my curiosity for years has been around sort of not only how we understand it has an impact in terms of what we actually focus on doing. And the stuff that I've learned in not only sort of the research work I've been able to do, the applied work that I've gotten to do with, I've worked with over 100 school districts around the country. I've worked with state education departments and helping them write state regulations and guidance documents around disproportionality. I've worked with the Department of Justice and the Office of Civil Rights in being as an expert consultant and doing a lot of data analysis for districts that have been really disproportionate. And so I've had an opportunity to kind of sit in multiple spheres and also have been a school board member, so, and within all of that, part of what I've come to wrestle with and understanding is that, we, the way in which we need to understand the nature of the dynamics that's happening is that there are ways in which our practices and our policies are existing that operate in a particular way that are latent with elements of what I consider sort of gaps. And these gaps are between what we envision something to be, right? And some of that envisioning is, there's good research that outlines, what is a particular, what are good, what's research around appropriate school climate or ways in which we do a particular instructional strategy. And then there's what we do, right? And the gap lives between those two, right? But the concern is who is most susceptible or most vulnerable when you have expansive set of gaps that are existing in systems, and as one of the dynamics that we have to contend with, right? So part of the sphere of sort of thinking and that needs to happen around between philanthropy and policymakers and practitioners is really wrestling through an understanding of the dimensions of those gaps. And the other facet is a degree to which we're understanding that those set of gaps are affecting particular groups of kids over time that sits alongside a broader history to which these things have happened to particular groups of kids, right? It's not like we're having of my particular attention is, around these issues of disproportionality. It's not all of a sudden we're having this over the last 20 years. We've had these issues for many decades, right? The first report that the U.S. Department of Education commissioned around disproportionality was in 1968. So we've had a long history of kind of knowing we've got populations of kids who are ending up in parts of our systems that we know over time has a negative effect in terms of their trajectory, right? And I always try to clarify, having a disability in of itself is not a problem. It's how we respond to, we provide supports on a consistent basis that leads to these set of issues. So to Giselle's point which I love, right? If we're not attentive to the system piece of it, and really relegating the attention to that, we have the potential of continuing to kind of keep it moving. But the other facet of it is we've also got to own the fact that there is also a body of mindsets and beliefs that give permission for some of those gaps to persist, right? And those mindsets and beliefs we have to wrestle through. I always think back to Bell Hooks said in one of her books, how do you legislate people to get along, right? We've never had a societal strategy to learn how to get along. We've just instituted, something. We are going to we're going to do Brown versus Board, or we're going to do Mendez versus Westminster, or, we're going to legislate IDEA. We're going to, but within there, we have never contended with, had a strategy around what is a fundamental way in which we are going to humanize each other, right? And so what's the work? What are the ways in which that are the intersection of philanthropy and policy and practice insist on that there be a reckoning in terms of the types of of pedagogical mindsets and beliefs that have to be non-negotiable to the manner in which we're going to envision policy, because otherwise we're just going to be running this wheel over and over again. And I'll say the last point that I'll make is that my concern, particularly in this moment, is the recognition that there's different levels of loss that have transpired over the course of this year. And my worry is that perception of the loss will there is a set of mindsets that can also be utilized to explain the loss as not necessarily in result of what we offered, which wasn't as great as we wanted it to be over this past year, but the loss may be attributed to the populations, particularly our most vulnerable populations, right? And like I'm wrestling with a couple of district leaders now who are, toying with the idea of holding populations back, as a result of the loss, and not even considering the potential of, well, maybe it's not a matter of placing the ownership on the kids, but rather placing the ownership on the system to generate and be operating in a way that reconciles. We're gonna have to do some level of remediation, but we've sure as heck got to accelerate majorly all of our student population. So that's where I see sort of the nexus of these set of folks interacting and needing to do work. And how do we kind of create some serious, just like we did serious innovation around developing these vaccines, we've got to innovate in education.
Thank you so much, Eddie. I know I was supposed to cut you off earlier, but I just couldn't because I wanted to hear all that. So sorry, Hunt Institute folks. All right, going on to Sarah and Eddie. My next question kind of hits on that. So we're going to have a chance to dig into more of that. So thank you for bringing up what you were. Sarah, let's go to you next. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I mean, first of all, introduce yourself, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. How should this collaboration happen to ensure students with disabilities have access to quality education during the recovery? Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm going to reiterate my colleagues and thank you for having us all here and talking about this really important issue. And I'm thrilled to be part of this panel. And I will not repeat the amazing things that my colleagues have just said. But so I'll give you a little background on myself and the Ability Challenge. I came to education as a lawyer, and so was handed special education because I was a lawyer. And I was working in an alternative context that said, how do you do this when school doesn't look like school? And so we spent a lot of time and a lot of resources to try and figure that out. I ended up finding my passion. And so fast forward several more years, I was, most of it was in New York City, and also working in the legal office at the same time. I'm now started the Ability Challenge as a way to work with schools and districts to build better special education programming, because I saw across settings this real focus on compliance running the work when it should be instruction running the work, right? And so, thinking about systems, I think, and we can talk more about this, but I think there are tons of systemic issues in that assumption. In terms of what we do now, I have three sort of concrete ideas. One is that we have to keep the focus on instruction. I have heard over and over and over and over and over again, let's get people back, let's get kids back into buildings. Let's make sure they're safe. Let's talk about whether the desks are 3 feet or 6 feet apart. Let's make sure that everybody has wipes. Those things are all very important, but we have to do it by thinking about what's good instruction first, and then thinking about how do we do that safely. And the instruction piece just seems to be totally missing from the conversation for me. Or maybe I'm not in the right conversations, but I just feel like that is something that I wish I was hearing more about. What does hybrid look like from the perspective of a kid sitting in a classroom and sitting at home, and how are they both learning at the same time? This is critical for students with disabilities. who need that specialized instruction in order to have access to the curriculum. So I think that's number one. I think number two, something that has been said by my peers, but I'm going to reiterate it, is that we have to give coverage to our educators to think boldly and radically. And we have to give them the resources and the space to be able to do that, because right now educators are so overwhelmed and burnt out and their minds are going everywhere. But this is a real opportunity to rethink some of those systems that have been historic and deep and seemingly unmovable, right? And they've stopped, basically. And so we have to put it back together, and we get to choose how we put it back together. And so I think all of the stakeholders in education have a responsibility to think radically. And I think the last thing, and I don't want to overstate or understate how hard this has been for a lot of people, but I do think there are pockets of things working. And especially for kids who have certain kinds of needs, like, for example, typical school building has a lot of sensory triggers for some kids. They don't have that right now, right? For many of them, they're in a remote setting. They don't have to listen to the band practicing. They don't have to navigate the social setting of going through the classroom, or going through the hallways. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to really think about what is working, why, for whom, and how do we build that into what we have going forward.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. So just a reminder, if you're watching, you can submit questions for the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, the little Q&A button there, and we will get to those near the end of the session. All right, Eddie, I want to go back to you. I had this question for you, and you already somewhat touched on it, but I'd love to talk more about how the intersectional identities of students with disabilities, so including race, gender, and income, how do those identities impact access to high quality education?
That's a great question. So I think there's a couple of ways in which we have to sort of understand this. First is reconciling that there is a historical context to which the organization of just schooling has cut across those particular demographic groups, right? So the ways in which race has had an interplay in how we decide who gets access to levels of quality education, right? And that's why we've had, with each one of them, there's been different levels of court cases that really sort of manifested why we've got to, we've got to address this, right? Around race, around gender, around disability status, around free lunch eligibility, and as well as language status. The concern is is what I call sort of the small texture dynamics that exist when you are, so it's not just a sort of the macro sort of how we may see, say something like, school funding is organized in a state that, privileges some communities over others, right? Those are the macro things. But then there's the micro sort of dynamics that live within districts and as well as live within schools that also helps to organize the ways in which we understand why those sort of dynamics exist, right? On one level, it's those micro level things that help to, for lack of a better term, give permission or justify why there's a continuation of some of those sort of interaction points that exist at a macro level. It's the, well, if the communities in this area would just do this, right? We could definitely be better performing schools, right? It's this, this idea of, reimagining or dreaming of a particularized population. So as we hear it in language, often, from practitioners who will say, well, if you take my students' disabilities out of my data, my classroom looks much better, right? As if like that is the totality. We are in a workforce environment that you can actually pick and choose what you are sort of organizing your work around, right? The training that that everyone gets is intended to, I should say that it actually manifesting this, but it's intended to really rely on sort of, you've done the work in terms of developing understanding of the science of learning that's going to be amenable for everyone, right? But as we move forward in this particular environment, and I think we've seen it over and over again with those different facets of data that have showcased, the impact that it's had in various communities, what it's meant to be hybrid, what it's meant to be virtual, right? Where the amount of loss that we can agree everybody's had loss, but the ways in which some communities have been able to mitigate the effect of the loss, right, as a result of the context that they're in, right? Those are the ways in which they're able to utilize means to, to kind of sort of support this. Like I think about my youngest child in our community decided to volunteer to be a tutor. And so I was like, oh, this is great. My youngest is is a junior in high school. They're a big science and math person. And so when I started seeing their tutors, who they were tutoring, who are not kindergartners, elementary age kids, I said, I was like, who's signing up for this? And it was fascinating. And they had a roster of about 5 or 6 kids that they were tutoring on a weekly basis. And they were all kids who lived in more affluent parts of our county. And they were all white. And I was like, wow, this is a great service. But what about other parts of the community that also are in need of these types of services? And all I thought was like, wow, this is a great strategy to mitigate the loss. Who's not getting an opportunity to get this stuff mitigated, right? And that's my concern as we move forward, is the question of high quality education that and its intersection with these particular identities, is how we are going to sort of really address the issue that in such a way that we don't place the blame on the populations who have not had an opportunity to gain or address their losses. And instead, we need to focus on sort of the nature to which we have to fix the system versus having a fix the kid strategy.
Thank you so much. Really, really good points. Sarah, switching gears, you touched on the need to redo systems, and I wanted to dig into that more. So I'd like to, kind of step back and see, in what ways do our systems of delivery for special education serve as barriers for students and teachers, these systems that we may need to rethink?
Good question. There's a lot there. I think, something that we at the Ability Challenge wrestle with and think a lot about and talk a lot about is the system around inclusion. I guess I'll talk about a couple of different ones. The first one is how we approach inclusion. And when we say inclusion, we're generally talking about students who spend some or all of their day in a general education setting, right? They have a classroom teacher or multiple classroom teachers. They may have some services push into the classroom. They may get pulled out for services, but generally speaking, they're being taught by a classroom teacher. And yet our systems our teacher preparation and in-service professional development systems have not caught up with the reality that we have more and more students in inclusive settings right now. And so we can't just put kids in inclusion. I mean, although the research does show that even if you just put kids in inclusion and do nothing else, it's still a benefit to them. But we also need to really think about how are we training and supporting all of our teachers to do the work that they need to do in the classroom, to identify what students really need, and then to be able to meet those needs. So that's what we at the Ability Challenge, we really focus on, because the statistic is like over 80% of teachers don't feel prepared to teach students with disabilities in their classrooms. And that is a shocking number. And so I think that's a huge barrier right now. As I said before, I think compliance and the pursuit of compliance without thinking about the instructional implications is also a barrier, because schools end up putting a lot of resources and a lot of time and a lot of emotional grit and work into that paperwork. And yet educators are so overwhelmed with that, and none of it's translating into services for kids in classrooms. And so that is a huge barrier, because we need to rethink how we're spending time so that we can spend our time on the things that are going to translate into more specialized instruction, better specialized instruction, more services, better services, et cetera. And I think something that my peers have talked about a little bit, but I think that the systems, sort of the ableism and the racism that is inherent in our systems and our failure to really address it head on, impacts pretty much every system that we have in schools. And so, we have an over-identification problem, particularly of students of color. We have a huge problem with disproportionate discipline, as we've heard, for students with disabilities and for students of color. And if we don't, and going back to the teacher preparation piece, if we don't work with our teachers to understand the lens with which they're coming to the work and how that impacts the ways in which they do things like manage a classroom or provide supports to kids, we're never going to get rid of some of those practices. And so, I think some of those are the most prevalent barriers right now that we're faced with. I feel like I could go on and on, but I will, I'll stop it there.
I feel like you were hitting so many excellent points. I could let you go on and on, but we will move on. But something you said when you were talking about teacher prep, it reminded me of an article I reported a few years ago about how well gen ed teachers are prepared for inclusive classrooms. And I spoke to so many gen ed teachers who said, I took special ed 101 in my teacher prep program, and that was it. And, we went over a few different types of disabilities, and I have no idea how to serve my students with disabilities. And it was just very striking how common that experience was, that special ed 101, and that's all they got.
That article was actually one of the pushes for me in forming the Ability Challenge, because
Wow.
I was experiencing similar feedback, right? And it's a huge an obstacle right now.
Well, thank you so much. Giselle, I would love to hear a little bit more from you about BELL. You mentioned that in your introduction. For those of you watching who don't know what that stands for, it's the Building Equitable Learning Environments Network that the Rakes Foundation is leading. So can you talk a little bit about how it's helping to spotlight the needs of students with disabilities in the K-12 education system?
Sure. I'm going to stand all the way up on the balcony in doing that, and then kind of pull the thread down. So again, Building Equitable Learning Environments, BELL network, established our BELL framework, right, as a guide for transforming student experiences and learning outcomes in the context of COVID, and what we understood would be a long, maybe not this long re-entry to recovery to potentially a reimagining space. And so we'll link that in the chat. But the evidence and research are abundantly clear, and confirm two things that educators have always known and told us. The first is that a young person's academic, social, and emotional development are inextricably linked. And that is whether they are on a spectrum of diverse needs, or what we think of as typical, right? I'd argue everyone is on a spectrum, but that's a grandstand for another day, right? The second is that the quality of a child's learning environment their experiences, the relationships that scaffold around them, right? And their access to opportunities determine their developmental and educational outcomes. That is even more true for diverse learners, but that's universal. And so the Bell framework and our essential actions, which are a subset of the framework that, to my mind, are what things that should have always been so, but in this period of COVID, if districts are doing nothing else, I think they should be really honoring 5 real pillars. And we have high yield tools, resources, some from my grantees, but just also looking across the field that are mapped and are cataloged in our library. The first of those pillars is, really anchoring on equity and justice through targeted universalism. And so that if I'm deconstructing that, it's to achieve equitable outcomes in schools and systems must take responsibility for shifting the daily learning experience of those who have been least well served historically. We recognize, for all of the reasons that Eddie is named and what Sarah has named around intersectionality. But we are clear that in almost every market, in almost every instance, Black, BIPOC, young people growing up in states of poverty, when overlaid with diverse learner needs, when overlaid with young people experiencing homelessness, those are the populations that have been least well served. So when you get eyes on them, really invest in understanding what will it take to shift their experience of school. For the young people that are over-identified, we know that they tend to be Black and brown, particularly boys, but increasingly girls. What is their experience of school? How do we design and understand what would it take to really create the most generative and empowering environment for them, right? When we can do that, we know that all boats rise, that every young person in a school and in an environment benefits, right? Not just because there are a carve out of services, but the entire environment shifts. The second is really anchoring on the science of learning and human development. There's so much that we know about the science, but that has not been incorporated into just the grammar of how we design. What does the physical space look like? What are the skill, will, and resources that the adults are afforded to honor the science? So we can actually create the kind of maximal learning environments and well-being for students as well as adults, right? Because adults are mediators and moderators of every student experience. So we know from the science, we actually could be implementing and actualizing that. Then the third is really centering on student experience. And if I do a click down on what that means, students can more fully and equitably be engaged in the design, in the naming of what works. And so there are tools, resources, free tools that my organization, I've invested in, PERTS. So Dave Panescu and what he and his team had developed by way of Copilot Elevate, which is a free tool for classroom educators. As you are shifting and you're modifying because you are more deeply wanting to nuance for the young people in your classroom, what we as adults imagine to be positive improvements or changes, we often see that they don't actually resonate in the way we imagine they will for young people. So Copilot Elevate is almost your rapid response across 3 domains that are most correlated to the science of learning and human development, about the experiences that young people should be having. Adults can be monitoring in real time, and it's quite easy. Even in the period of COVID, there's quite a bit on our website about how educators are experiencing Copilot Elevate. The fourth is the collaborative design, inquiry and design. So engaging in shared inquiry, right? And so we often think about and talk about diverse learners, young people with disabilities as a population that aren't fully, that shouldn't be experiencing the same level of efficacy as other kids. Wrong, right? We should be leaning in to actually engage with them, to understand and have them be telling us, right? So seek to understand and respond to their desires, their interests, their experiences, and then using that knowledge in partnership with them to drive decision-making, design, resource allocation, and accountability structures in the ways that I would say the most dynamic and progressive, and I don't mean progressive as a political ideology, progressive as in moving the needle on transformation. Districts are empowering young people, community operators, and families to sit on the problem identification teams, the redesign teams, the implementation auditing teams, right? Real positions of leadership. And then the fifth is where I was starting to name, when you're anchoring on young people's experience, you are putting them in positions of power to tell you, to guide you, and then be in the co-construct. This fifth is around the continuous improvement and the adaptive systems, right? And so again, where the system has to, by design, be taking responsibility for having the kind of data and analytics to understand who is least well served, keeping eyes on all the young people in a district. You know, we can look across even highly resourced districts across the 13,000, how many young people have not checked back in? Where did they go? Particularly for young people with compounded needs, emotional, cognitive, behavioral, and then in communities where they might be parentified, they might actually have to be working, right? Like there are so many things that could pull young people out of the system in this environment. Having the core infrastructure to see, understand, and then deploy resources as just the baseline for what we take responsibility for, I think, is the fifth and core to what we should be doing.
Thank you so much. And Allison put a link to the Bell Network in the chat. So if any of you watching want to click on that, you can learn even more. We are going to switch to our Q&A portion. Just a reminder, you can submit a question at the bottom of your screen. So this is for Eddie. How do you ensure that students identified as both multilingual language learners and students with disabilities receive both equitable access and equitable services in a way that ensures one service does not supersede another? And with intense and deep issues concerning racism going on currently across the US, how do institutions of higher education make sure that MLL are not subjected to discrimination? I know that's a big question and we don't have a lot of time, but would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure, I love that I get some of the easy questions. I'm like, oh. So there's a dynamic that is a historical dynamic that's existed in terms of our multi-language learners, is the recognition of this sort of intersection of how sort of make a determination when our multi-language learners are having difficulty, the degree to which we're able to tease out what's a language acquisition issue in relation to a disability issue, and both can exist at the same time, right? And but unfortunately there's a rub that happens in terms of the practice of it, which is that practitioners at times are left with a sort of a uncertainty as one, can we have both services happening at the same time? Can I get language acquisition services and get special education services occurring for the same body, as if there is a finiteness to the availability of these sets of resources, and or there's a struggle around something as, well, I'm not going to call it simple, but something that can be managed, which is the master schedule of a school, right? It's like, how do I provide the language service and when I have to get, as I've heard from practitioners. So there's a longstanding reality around that, which touches on some level sort of the innovation around assessments, and as well as the level of capacity and efficacy of the practitioners who are swimming with that particular sort of or need that level of specialization to really provide that set of focus. I've worked in school districts where I've sat in rooms where psychologists have said, I'm not sure what it is, but let's just give them some type of or disability category and let's see what happens, right? Which to me really challenges the degree to which there is a science to it, and on at the expense of populations who have a level of vulnerability because of how rest of society reacts to the type of their sort of their reality, right? So there's nothing wrong with being a multi-language learner, but there's something wrong about being a multi-language learner within the context of our schools, right? Because we have that conundrum, and that becomes a concern. The dynamic around, in particular, sort of the ism that we're speaking about, particularly around multi-language learners, is also the nature to which there's two facets to it. One is language issues that are tied to race are also about the hegemony that may exist around particular languages that we see as more problematic than others, right? So meaning, how we provide and organize language services for populations whose languages we treat as something that is we want to coddle and we see as a benefit for our society, right? It's I've been in school settings where they have preferenced how they provide language support services for kids whose first language is French versus Spanish, right? But that what's undergirding that, because all I see is like kids are needing language services, but what's undergirding is sort of this sort of layered preferencing, that's language preferencing that exists within our own imagination, and some of that has to do with a larger sort of societal ways in which we have codified particular communities and their languages as problem-based, while others are seen as languages of desire or of less problem, I should say. So I think there's whatever we sort of contend to do, we have to, in my vantage point, there has to be an attention to this rub between sort of how we are doing our language services for kids who also may need special education services at the same time.
Great. Thank you so much, Eddie. Sarah, the next question is for you. What is the profile of an educator who knows how to manage those challenges for our students with disabilities, especially post-COVID? What are some realistic tools, strategies, or resources that educators can use today?
Oh, all right. Well, I saw a lot of those questions come in about like, okay, well, give me a tool, right? And I think it's not just a tool. I think the lack of tools is a huge barrier, but it is a set of skills and mindsets, as we've talked about, in addition to the tools. And so when I think about like putting myself in a headspace of a non-special ed trained teacher, I think there are some, in terms of skills and mindsets, the first thing that we talk a lot about is around this idea of collaboration, really, and targeted collaboration about student needs and in a way that is supportive of student success. And Eddie, you said humanizing education, and I really love that term because that's what I think when I think of the collaborative approach. We want to see educators talking to each other about what's working in their classrooms, what's not working, how can they really support an individual student, and how can they support all of their students, right? Good, careful co-planning is a piece of this process. Consultation, even if your school, I know a lot of schools don't have structures for these things. Even if your school doesn't have structures for these things, there are ways to do it that get to the end goal, which is delivery of tailored and specialized instruction in the classroom, or services that are going to support a student to remove barriers to the content, right? Another big thing we like to see is that educators are presuming competence of all students. They're starting from that mindset of, I need to give all of my students an opportunity to show me what they know, right? And I think a lot about assessment in particular, because when we think about checking for understanding and we use a tool or a strategy that's playing right into those students' disability, we're not going to be able to learn what they know about most of the content. So I think of, for example, a student with dyslexia, you give them a reading test to test what they know in history, you're not going to get, you might, but you might not get the information that you need because you're not assessing them in a way that is going to allow them to show you what they know. Now that we have all been forced to get on a computer, there are a million opportunities to be creative about how we allow students to do that, right? We can say, show me what you know, do a video, draw a picture, write a story, make a PowerPoint, I don't know, code something, you know, record your voice, right? There's a lot of opportunity for being creative in that way. And I think also going back to what Giselle was saying, another big sort of strategy and something that we really want to see in our general educators and all educators is that they're including students in the process, right? They're working with students on how to advocate for what they need. They're having students participate or lead their IE meetings. They're helping students talk about what their disability is and how they're overcoming it, and what are the skills that they're working on, and what are the things that they're great at. You know, far too many times I've talked to kids and they've said, I just didn't feel smart at school, right? And we want to create an environment where every kid feels smart at school. So those are 3 ideas. I mean, I also have a shameless plug for the course that we're offering. So if anyone's interested, we have a course for general ed teachers where we talk a lot about all of these different issues. But hopefully that gives some folks a sort of lead into some of the things that we're working on.
Sarah, when you mentioned the competence aspect, it reminded me of this interview I had several years ago when we were investigating this general theme of low expectations in schools for students with disabilities. And I spoke to a student who has dyslexia, and she said when she went to her high school, she was immediately put in an elective class where they did random projects, like they made cars out of shoe boxes, and she was trying to go to college and she just didn't understand why she was in this class. And when I called the principal to ask about it, he said, well, our students with IEPs go to that class, and if they show they don't need it, then we move them to another class. And I was like, well, why is that the automatic thing instead of, you know, they go into an appropriate class and then we can think about maybe putting them in a different class, right? Like it was just kind of bizarre that like that was automatically just the expectation was they all need to go in this class. So when you said that, it just reminded me of just how kind of mind blowing it is that's happening. All right, we have one last question, and I would love to hear from all of you about this. We only have a few minutes, so we're going to try to keep our answers maybe 1 or 2 minutes long. And Giselle, I'd love to start with you answering this. So last question, how can we radically change things? We've talked about everything that needs to change. Given the influx of federal relief dollars, what are some radical changes you would all like to see? Giselle, let's start with you if you don't mind.
Wow, and in 2 minutes or less. So honoring the five core like pillars or frameworks, I mean, those are actually radical because they don't show up with any consistency across the 13,000, let alone in any one district. So having the data and analytics to see and deploy resources based on student need, not based on housing stock, funding formula, adult needs, all of those things. Radical. I think there's also, it is a radical idea to shift the vision of school and the goal of our educational system such that every young person comes out healthy, whole, and by healthy and whole, I mean an understanding of self, culturally and identity affirmed, empowered, having had sufficient exposure, not just based on the last example of that's where the IEP kids go, or that's where the Spanish speakers, not from Spain, but from Guatemala go, or that's where the poor kids go, but really providing the kinds of access and opportunities for young people's light bulb to go on, right? If I geek out for 30 seconds, epigenetics says that our genes are we respond to the stimuli that we are given. We have Mozarts and Einsteins sitting in classrooms, SPED classroom, gen ed classrooms, but they've not been given the opportunity to strut their stuff. And so creating that kind of universal access. I would also call out the toolkit, and we'll put that in the chat, that NCLD just dropped, that our teacher go live now resources, but also some reflective tools, because we've got to get our adult order in-house as well.
Thank you so much. Eddie, radical changes, 1 minute.
So I would say two quick things. One is, I think we need to further extend this pause that we have around or on in terms of testing around accountability, extending that pause for a longer period of time. Two is to really take a moment within the sphere of pedagogy. And some of what transpired of this past year was an opportunity for a lot of practitioners to reimagine what learning can happen in a virtual space. And I think not only sort of the format was a new endeavor, but just the idea of re-innovating the idea of learning, that if we could have more time, in some ways, have a bit of, I hate to call it a boot camp, but let's go back to it. I'm, as a former high school teacher, I'm like, I would have loved to have been in a space to just blow up the way in which I imagine and do learning within the context of my classroom, and to have a dedicated boot camp time to just go back to the fundamentals and really do it, and give ourselves that permission, right? Give ourselves September to just innovate our learning strategies.
Great, thank you so much. Sarah, your thoughts?
All right, radical. Well, I said we got to give space at the beginning. I said we got to give space to for folks to be radical. So I'm going to offer something that's radical. I think we need to rethink the whole idea of a continuum of services that IDEA requires every local education authority to implement. I think with small schools, charter schools, creative solutions that are coming up around pods, right? The continuum approach where you are offering a set of interventions that progressively get more restrictive, it doesn't work anymore. And so we need to rethink that entire approach to the law and blow it up, right? As Eddie just said, we're going to blow up our classrooms in September. So let's blow up IDEA too. And I think we need to be thinking more about how do we support a neurodiverse universe of kids in our school buildings? How do we make them feel safe to take risks and to learn and to feel smart and to make sure that they're getting, a certain basic minimum legal amount of supports, right? I mean, I think you can't blow up the system completely and not require some minimum at the bottom. But I think we are ways away from what a continuum in theory could look like. And so, I say, let's get rid of it. If I'm being really radical, let's just get rid of it and figure some new system.
Great, thank you so much. That is time. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And Allison, I'm going to turn it over to you. I think you have some resources to share.
Great, yes, thanks so much. Thanks to Jackie and our panelists. That was an incredible conversation, and we're really looking forward to providing some follow-up information with all of you in our follow-up blog post. Also want to give you a heads up that our next webinar is taking place on Tuesday, April 8th It's part of our post-secondary pathways series. And this conversation will be focused on building coalitions of support for higher education. We certainly hope that you will all join us for that conversation. Thanks again to our great panelists today. Thanks to all of you for joining us, and we hope you have a great afternoon.